Imagine you enter a strange room where a computer tells you that hidden somewhere in the building is a cube. Then it asks you, what does the cube contain? Most of us would recognize this to be a futile question. The cube could be large or small. It could be a solid block or a vacuum chamber of nothing but sparse particles of gas. Or it might contain any one of billions of permutations of familiar or novel objects. You could never give a precise, justifiable answer. But if you were asked what does the cube not contain, you could give many answers. For example, the cube couldn't possibly contain the Amazon River, the planet Mars, or absurd objects such as a bed made of sleep. In fact, there'd be more perfectly valid answers to this second question than you could list in 1,000,000 lifetimes. This illustrates an interesting asymmetry concerning the contents of this cube. Despite there being countless possibilities and impossibilities, without evidence from the cube itself, we can only ever make valid justifiable statements about what is not inside the cube, not what is. It's true that someone claiming, for example, that the cube contained nothing but a wooden spoon might be right, but since without evidence they could provide no valid justification for such a claim, there'd be literally no reason for anyone to accept it. What if we were talking about a realm of existence independent of our universe, that like the concealed cube was physically inaccessible to us? Would things be different? Would we be able to deduce precisely what occupied such a realm, such as a divine being? No, there's the same asymmetry as before. Countless kinds of being might exist independently of our universe. Countless logically impossible beings cannot. But while we can list many kinds of being that can't exist there because they violate logic, we can't list those, if any, that do. Any attempt to argue that a specific divine being exists in an inaccessible realm of reality is an attempt to argue for either the impossible or the unknowable. Logic alone can refute impossible beings, but it can't show that possible beings actually exist without evidence. If you can't at some point provide measurable, verifiable evidence for the specific being you claim exists, all the argument in the world won't establish your claim as fact. This is one reason why, as soon as anyone claims they have a logical argument that requires the existence of one personal creator of our universe, we know it'll be fallacious because they failed at a basic level to understand what's required to establish such an existence claim. It's just a question of identifying where the errors are. For example, the theologian William Lane Craig has asserted that our universe had an original cause, which, because it created our time and space, had to transcend time and space. Transcending our time and space doesn't necessarily mean something transcends all time and space. However, his conclusion that this non-temporal, non-spatial cause would have to be a changeless disembodied mind is more seriously flawed. A changeless mind is by definition non-functioning. Minds and purposeful creation depend on change. Craig's changeless creator is self-contradicting and belongs to the category of the logically impossible. However seemingly plausible they may sound to the unwary or the already persuaded, all popular arguments for the existence of specific gods are based on false premises and or conclusions and unjustified presuppositions, and 100 invalid arguments don't accumulate into one valid one. Many people with theistic beliefs don't get tangled up in pursuing doomed arguments like these. They know they can't prove gods with logic and have no need to do so. They realize their beliefs are personal and that others are entitled to different views. However, when you're not so willing to respect difference, when you disparage, attack, or work to create disadvantage for others because they don't share your beliefs, it shouldn't surprise you when those you try to oppress object to this unreasonable attitude and expose the flawed arguments that shore it up. A belief in one or more gods might sustain you in your own life, but when you pressure others to adopt your beliefs and participate in practices associated with those beliefs, you give up the luxury of not having to explain yourself. You give yourself the burden of proof. And certain reasons that might seem sound when justifying a belief to yourself are simply not valid when you're trying to establish existence claims to other people, however passionately you express them. You can't pester and bully people and then retreat behind faith when challenged on your behaviour. And if you can't demonstrate that gods exist, resorting to emotional blackmail to try to get people to believe is a dishonest tactic. When those who don't believe in gods show theistic claims to be invalid, it's often claimed that they're trying to prove gods don't exist. In fact, all they're doing is exposing flawed reasoning and encouraging intellectual honesty. It's understandable that when some have their claims debunked, it's an uncomfortable feeling, and employing red herrings becomes an attractive way to wriggle out of admitting their mistakes. But debunking claims about the existence of gods is just showing those who make such claims that they can't assert what they're trying to assert. The question of defining divine entities is where the problems begin. As soon as you define any god, you must justify why you've defined it that way, giving a valid reason for each quality you're attributing to it. Many who realize they can't justify any particular definitions avoid them altogether. But without definition, there's no adequately formed concept to have a belief about. And this is the stumbling block when people are asked to define the gods they claim exist. As their divine definitions become more specific, they have more to justify. The flaws in their logic become more numerous, and their arguments become easier to refute. Conversely, as their definitions become more vague, the entities they're proposing cease to have any practical relevance. Ironically, the way many people define gods means that as well as having no logical support, they can't be supported with evidence either. For example, as soon as you say God X is non-physical, you've proposed a being that can't be quantified, tested, or perceived, even in principle. You literally have nothing to work with. When trying to justify non-physical entities, people will often point out that we can't see the wind, but we still know it's there. However, this analogy is flawed. We know the wind is there because it is physical. Not only can we measure it and perceive it directly through our sense of touch, it can knock us off our feet and destroy buildings. The physical force it exerts could hardly be more dramatic. Indeed, we use that force to generate electricity. By contrast, it's not even clear what a being with no conceivable physical characteristics is supposed to mean. Even if you were proposing an entity that had a different type of physical existence, making it undetectable to humans, you'd have enough trouble explaining how you could know it was there. Many claim that the existence of particular gods can be demonstrated, that their powers can be manifested physically, and that these physical manifestations count as evidence. But even if we were to witness an event that genuinely challenged our understanding, that wouldn't justify inferring any specific divine agency. At most, it could indicate power, intelligence, and/or technology that was unknown, both in its number and its nature. Imagine a group of people unfamiliar with electronic technology being duped into watching a carefully staged CGI animation of a man turning into a lion. If they thought they'd just seen evidence of divine magic, we'd know that conclusion was false and due entirely to an illusion of technology beyond their experience. Likewise, if you were to see something genuinely jaw-dropping like stars spelling out words in the sky, you'd have no basis for drawing any reliable conclusions about the specific causes of what you were witnessing. You could be having your brain expertly controlled by aliens. You could be having a psychotic break from reality. We already know that brains can conjure up richly detailed worlds when we dream, and that their dysfunction can cause us to hallucinate. If some kind of intelligence was responsible, anything with the ability to manipulate physical matter or our perceptions to that extent could easily disguise itself, so we could never be sure of its identity. With such fallible brains and such limited technology, a spectacle like this would simply be beyond the scale of what we could apprehend or investigate. Could life forms of vastly greater intelligence and power exist beyond the current reach of our perception and technology? Certainly. But even if we were ever to find evidence of greater intelligence, that would still not constitute evidence of specific gods. Even if some kind of intelligence initiated the existence of our universe, there's nothing to say what the nature of that intelligence was. Whether it was a single rather than a collective intelligence, whether or not part of that intelligence remains interested in the universe, let alone the affairs of humans, whether or not that intelligence is aware of our tiny planet, let alone capable of communicating with its inhabitants, or even whether or not that intelligence still exists. When you impartially review a factual claim that, for example, one divine universe creator currently monitors and judges every human life, the layers of unjustified assumption needed to make such a claim become starkly apparent. One would be no less justified in proposing a race of aliens that created our universe with an advanced machine and annihilated themselves in the process. As soon as you propose any specific being, the nature of whose existence can't be reliably examined and quantified, even in principle, you're talking about a non-scientific concept that's insupportable by either logic or evidence. Without logic or evidence at your disposal, you have no grounds for demanding that anyone agrees with you. You certainly have no grounds for bullying and ostracizing them when they don't. But if that's the way you deal with independent thought, your fallacious arguments will continue to be exposed until you grow out of your need for everyone to subscribe to your faith-based ideas. When you start being honest with yourself about what you know and what you don't know, you're likely to realize that you're in no position to be shouting the odds. And when you understand that it's behavior that has the practical impact on our lives, you may realize that it's not whether we believe in gods, but how we treat each other that says the most about our character. If you attack, condemn, or use emotional blackmail on people because they don't share your belief in one or more gods, you're invited to consider what that says about you and how it squares with the values you claim to embrace.